A comprehensive solution to the problem includes just eventually removing all of the military from the mines or demilitarizing the mines. So I'm going to talk now about some of the obstacles to that. And I'm going to look at it in the context of a peace negotiation. So one of the problems in the Eastern Congo with fighting these rebel groups, we talked about the area in question is the size of California, but there's only a couple hundred miles of paved roads in the entire country. So it's the perfect condition for an insurgency movement, and the worst conditions in the world to try and fight against the insurgency movement. You have rebels that just kind of hide in the bush, and it's impossible to just completely militarily defeat a rebel group. So this fighting has been going on for 12 years. Eventually, some of the rebel groups want to come into peace negotiations. That's the strategy that international communities push for in some instances, and what the government has pursued now is, let's try and negotiate a peace because we're not going to wipe out every rebel on the ground. So we have negotiations with the rebels. After this happens, there's a couple things that happen to the rebel group itself. A large chunk of it just becomes a part of the National Army, as I was talking about earlier. Some of these aren't even Congolese citizens. They are rebels that were from Rwanda or Uganda or Burundi originally, and the government tries to filter these out and repatriate them back to the country, but it doesn't always work. So you have an attempt to integrate and disarm people from the rebel group, repatriate people who aren't from the Congo back. But there's a lot of problems here. One, the record keeping, as you can imagine, isn't too great. So it's really hard to tell who was a rebel and who wasn't. And there's incentives for the rebel group commanders to say that their national army, there's an incentive for the rebel groups to say that they have a lot more people under their control because they get leverage when they negotiate with the government. And they also get a higher rank in the National Army if they come in and say, hey, I am bringing 1,000 rebels in. I'm doing you guys a favor because I'm bringing 1,000 rebels in. I want promotion. So there's all kinds of incentives for the rebel groups to not be forthright in the actual numbers of the members of the rebel group. The other problem is, in the case that I talked about, when the rebel groups integrate in, they're supposed to turn in all of their arms. Because they're becoming that National Party Army, they'll get their weapons there. But as we'll see in the case study, only about half of the people show up with weapons when they're integrated. So half of the rebel group, it's not the case that half of the rebel group just didn't have a weapon to start out with. And you have these stockpiles that are maintained. So if the rebel group actually breaks off from the National Army again, they'll have weapons. So that's a big problem as well. So once this imperfect integration process takes place, you have the rebel integrated army that are now going into military operations against different other rebel groups to try and wipe them out, like the FDLR that was mentioned earlier. The problem is these former rebels are now commanding some of these military units, and as part of the peace negotiation, which all happens under the table, you have an implicit guarantee that the former rebels, in turn for becoming a part of the army, get access to the mineral areas. So they're now part of the National Army, but they're the part of the National Army that's in the mining. And as a part of this, there's conflict, there's that whole chart of things that David was talking about, all the different ways that people who control the mines can extract income, often which is accompanied by violence. And there's inevitable backlash from the community, from when the UN does its investigations and says, hey, these people are committing crimes against humanity pretty much, we should do something about this. We just negotiated a peace deal with them, we should expect better. So there's backlash from rebel groups, and the rebel groups say, hey, we were just put in this area, we are part of the National Army now, you should not be moving us. So there's kind of this inherent tension now where they were former rebels, they're now part of the National Army, but you have the exact same problem as before. And this can lead to a couple of different outcomes where when this type of tension happens. There could be a renegotiation with the rebels. The rebel group could just break off if they were forced out of the different mines, or we could just go back up to step 3 here, where they just continue to control the mine. And this tension exists. So I want to just kind of go through this same process with a quick case study, and then we'll take questions. The CNDP, which David mentioned earlier, is a rebel group that has strong ties to the Rwandan government and the Rwandan senior military. And in the last couple of years, there was an unprecedented political agreement between Kabila in DRC and Kagame in Rwanda to take care of the CNDP problem and focus on the FDLR, who are led by the former genocidaires from the Rwandan genocide. So in 2009, there's the Goma Agreement, which is the process which is the formal document that integrates the CNDP into the National Army. And they then enter into joint military operations with the larger parts of the FARDC. And they now, senior commanders of the CNDP, control the mine that David was referring to earlier, the DCA mine in Walikale. And this is one of the most profitable mines. It's one of the biggest and most profitable mines in the eastern Congo. And during the process of securing this mine, these are the two military operations here. There was all kinds of violence against civilians. In fact, a lot of commentators have said that these two operations were just total failures because the price that was extracted from the civilian population didn't really meet the equivalent outcome of beating back the FDLR a little bit. So now there's been complaints about these rebel slash military units that are controlling these areas. And so there was talk about just moving them out. We're just going to take the former CNDP and relocate them around the country, which didn't go over too well with the former CNDP. So now you are in this, if you're the Congolese government, you're in this kind of catch-22. Do you move them away and try and demilitarize the area and risk them breaking off because they still have their same parallel command structure, they still have stashes of weapons that they can just go back and fighting, or do you just let them be? So we don't really know where this is going to go yet. But this isn't just a problem that's limited to the CNDP. This is just a snapshot to show how complex the political situation is on the ground. I'm just going to go through a couple points here. And I want to show that even if there is a political will on the part of the national government to just say, hey, we want to demilitarize the mining sector, it's not going to be that easy. These are just some of the takeaway points. And I just wanted to talk about just kind of how cyclical the problem is and why it's why kind of this series of events is self-perpetuating. So with that, I think I will end, and David and I will take questions.